This is not a story about money. It is a story about power, delay, and consequences. We are living inside the largest financial experiment ever attempted, one built on the assumption that debt can expand forever without breaking the system beneath it. Governments borrow without restraint. Central banks create money without limits. Entire societies are told this is normal, manageable, permanent. But history tells a very different story. Debt has never been harmless. It has always ended in rupture, transfer of pain, and social reset. The question is no longer whether this system will crack. It is when it does, who absorbs the damage, and who walks away untouched. Debt did not begin as a financial convenience. It began as a mechanism of order. Long before modern markets, long before banks or interest rates, debt existed as a social structure embedded into the earliest civilizations. The first written records discovered in Mesopotamia were not poems or laws. They were ledgers, clay tablets tracking who owed grain, who owed livestock, and who was bound to whom through obligation. From the very beginning, debt was not neutral. It defined hierarchy. In those early societies, debt was inseparable from authority. Kings and priests stood above the system as arbiter. Time, 0.5s. They enforced obligations, collected payments, and decided when enforcement went too far. This was not generosity. It was survival. Ancient rulers understood a truth that would be repeatedly forgotten. When obligations accumulate beyond what a population can bear, the system destabilizes. Farmers lose land, families lose freedom, social cohesion fractures. That is why early civilizations practiced periodic debt forgiveness. These jubilees erased obligations in sweeping resets. Fields were returned. Slaves were freed. Records were wiped clean. The purpose was not mora. Time, 0.5s. It was mechanical. Too much debt threatened the labor base, the military base, and ultimately, the ruler's power. Debt created control, but unchecked debt destroyed the system that control depended on. This pattern appeared again and again. Whenever debt grew faster than productive capacity, tension followed. Rulers either relieved the pressure or faced revolt, collapse, or invasion. Debt was power, but only within limits. As economies evolved, so did debt. By the Renaissance, obligations were no longer denominated in grain or cattle. They were measured in gold and credit. Banking families in Florence and other city-states perfected the art of lending to sovereigns. Kings borrowed to wage wars, build monuments, and expand influence. The sums were enormous. The risks were existential. Debt had shifted from a personal contract to a geopolitical weapon. When monarchs defaulted, banks collapsed. When banks collapsed, cities fell. The system expanded, but the underlying logic did not change. Borrowing enabled ambition. Excess borrowing guaranteed crisis. One of the clearest early examples came from Spain in the 16th century. Flooded with silver from the Americas, the Spanish crown appeared invincible. Wealth poured in. Military campaigns multiplied. Spending exploded. Yet, despite this apparent abundance, Spain declared bankruptcy multiple times. The reason was simple. Debt grew faster than real capacity. Gold did not save the empire. It accelerated its overreach. This revealed a critical lesson that history would repeat endlessly. Access to resources does not eliminate limits. It obscures them. Debt allows societies to consume tomorrow's output today. When tomorrow fails to deliver time, 0.3s, the reckoning arrives. Over time, debt became institutionalized. It moved from royal treasuries into national systems. Wars were no longer funded solely by taxation or plunder. They were financed through borrowing. Entire populations became indirect guarantors of decisions they did not make. The consequences became collective. By the modern era, debt was no longer episodic. It was permanent. States normalized borrowing as a baseline condition rather than an emergency tool. This shift marked a turning point. Debt stopped being something that demanded eventual resolution. It became something assumed to roll forward indefinitely. What had once been constrained by physical limits now floated on trust. As long as creditors believed repayment was possible, the system functioned. When belief cracked, collapse followed. This tension sat beneath every expanding economy. The common thread through these eras is not technology or ideology. It is human behavior within systems of obligation. Leaders borrow to extend power. Societies tolerate debt because the cost feels distant. Reset mechanisms disappear because they are politically inconvenient. Pressure accumulates quietly. Debt does not announce danger when it forms. It disguises risk as progress. Roads get built, wars get financed, living standards rise, but underneath, the balance shifts, obligations concentrate, flexibility disappears. Eventually, the system reaches a point where adjustment becomes impossible without pain. This is not a modern flaw, it is an ancient pattern. From Mesopotamian fields to Renaissance empires, debt has always followed the same arc. Creation, expansion, strain, reckoning. The tools change. The outcome does not. Understanding this origin matters because it reframes the present. The problem today is not mismanagement. It is scale. Debt has escaped the mechanisms that once kept it survivable. There are no jubilees. There are no resets without systemic shock. The constraints that protected earlier societies have been removed. What follows is not an anomaly. It is the continuation of a structure that has always ended the same way, once obligations outgrow reality. As debt matured, it stopped being a domestic issue and became an instrument of empire. By the late medieval and early modern period, borrowing was no longer confined to households or cities. It was embedded in statecraft. Credit determined which wars could be fought, which territories could be held, and which powers would dominate trade routes. Financial capacity began to rival military strength as the true measure of power. The rise of powerful banking networks transformed the political landscape. Lending to rulers became a business of scale. Sovereigns borrowed not for short-term survival, but for expansion. Armies were financed years before. Taxes could be collected. Ships were built on credit. Campaigns were launched on promises. Debt allowed states to project power far beyond their immediate resources. But this leverage came with a cost. When wars failed or revenues fell short, repayment collapsed. Creditors demanded concessions. Political autonomy weakened. Debt quietly rewired sovereignty. The Italian city-states understood this risk early. Banking families navigated a delicate balance between profit and survival. Lending too aggressively to unstable rulers invited ruin. Yet competition pushed boundaries. Credit expanded faster than discipline. Time. Fives. The system became fragile. Spain provides the clearest demonstration of how imperial ambition interacts with debt. In the 16th century, vast quantities of silver flowed into the Spanish treasury from the Americas. On the surface, this should have eliminated financial constraint. Instead, it fueled overextension. Military campaigns multiplied across Europe. Administrative costs ballooned. Borrowing increased even as treasure ships arrived. The illusion of wealth masked structural weakness. Spain's obligations grew faster than its ability to service them. Inflation eroded domestic productivity. Revenue lagged behind expenditure. Despite access to unprecedented resources, the Crown defaulted repeatedly. Each bankruptcy rippled through European finance, destabilizing lenders and allies alike. The lesson was stark. Debt does not care about appearances. Abundance can accelerate collapse when it encourages unchecked expansion. The presence of resources does not eliminate limits. It delays their recognition. As empires grew, debt intertwined with diplomacy. Loans became leverage. Creditors influenced policy. Financial dependence shaped alliances. States that borrowed heavily lost freedom of action long before they lost territory. Collapse often began in balance sheets, not battlefields. This dynamic repeated across centuries. Borrowing enabled dominance in the short term, while undermining resilience in the long term. The larger the empire, the greater the temptation to postpone restraint. Debt offered a way to avoid difficult choices. Taxes could remain low. Spending could continue. Consequences could be deferred. Eventually, deferral ran out. By the 19th century, debt had become normalized at the national level. Governments issued bonds as routine instruments. Investors treated sovereign promises as safe assets. The system appeared stable. But stability rested on continuous growth and uninterrupted confidence. When either faltered, the consequences were severe. Defaults triggered social unrest. Currency collapses wiped out savings. Political systems radicalized under pressure. Debt did not simply reflect economic failure, it amplified it. The pattern was no longer isolated to individual empires. It became global. Financial contagion spread across borders. A crisis in one region destabilized others through credit links. Debt bound nations together in ways that made collapse systemic rather than local. By the early 20th century, the scale had changed. but the logic remained intact. States had learned how to borrow on an unprecedented level. What they had not learned was how to exit safely. The world was about to discover what happens when debt is no longer a tool of expansion, but a structural dependency. The 20th century marked the moment when debt escaped its historical boundaries. What had once been constrained by political caution and material limits became embedded into the architecture of the global system. The First World War did not merely redraw borders, it shattered financial discipline. Nations financed destruction on credit at a scale never seen before, assuming victory would make repayment manageable. When the war ended, those assumptions collapsed. Europe emerged burdened by obligations that could not be honored in real terms. Reparations imposed on Germany under the Treaty of Versailles were not designed around economic capacity. They were political punishments translated into financial demands. The numbers ignored reality. Payment required either extraction beyond productivity or monetary debasement. Germany chose the latter. The result was not abstract. It was lived. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s erased savings, destroyed trust, and hollowed out the middle class. Currency lost meaning. Prices changed by the hour. Wages lagged behind survival. Debt obligations denominated in foreign terms became impossible to meet. What followed was not stability, but radicalization. Financial collapse reshaped politics and paved the path toward the Second World War. This episode revealed a critical truth. Debt is not contained within ledgers, and when it becomes unpayable, it spills into society. It alters behavior. It destabilizes institutions. It fractures legitimacy. Debt was no longer just an economic variable. It had become a catalyst for systemic breakdown. In response to this chaos, global leaders attempted to design a system that would prevent a repeat. In 1944, representatives gathered at the Bretton Woods Conference to construct a new financial order. The goal was stability. The method was structure. The United States, holding the majority of the world's gold reserves after the war, assumed the central role. The system anchored global currencies to the United States dollar, which itself was convertible to gold at a fixed price. On paper, this imposed discipline. In practice, it concentrated power. Every major economy now relied on the credibility of a single issuer. Debt issuance, trade balances, and monetary policy across the world rested on the promise that the United States would restrain itself. For a time, it worked. Growth accelerated, trade expanded, confidence returned. Debt increased, but within perceived limits. The system appeared balanced, yet the underlying incentive structure had not changed. Borrowing remained politically attractive. Restraint remained inconvenient. As decades passed, pressure accumulated. The cost of maintaining global leadership rose. Military commitments expanded. Domestic programs grew. The United States issued more dollars than its gold reserves could support. Foreign governments noticed. Confidence began to strain. By the late 1960s, the contradiction was unavoidable. Dollars circulated globally in quantities far exceeding the gold available for conversion. When foreign holders demanded settlement, the system faced collapse. In 1971, the United States severed the link between the dollar and gold. The anchor was removed. This decision transformed the nature of debt. Currency was no longer tied to a finite resource. It became elastic. Governments could borrow and issue without material constraint, limited only by confidence. Central banks gained unprecedented influence. Interest rates became tools of policy rather than reflections of scarcity. The discipline that had once enforced repayment vanished. Debt shifted from a temporary mechanism to a permanent condition. Growth slowdowns were met with lower rates and increased borrowing. Crises were patched with new layers of leverage. Each intervention stabilized the present by sacrificing the future. The system had entered a new phase. Debt was no longer an emergency response. It was the foundation. And once embedded at this scale, there was no simple way out. Once debt became untethered from physical limits, its growth accelerated. The 1970s did not mark restraint. They marked experimentation. With no gold anchor, central banks discovered they could shape economic behavior through interest rates. Borrowing could be encouraged or suppressed at will. In theory, this granted control. In reality, it encouraged dependence. When growth slowed, rates were lowered. When markets faltered, liquidity was injected. Each intervention postponed adjustment while expanding the scale of obligations. Debt no longer corrected excess. Time, 0.5s. It absorbed it. The system learned that pain could be deferred, and so it was. By the 1980s, this approach was institutionalized. Governments expanded public debt under the justification of security, reform, and competitiveness. Large deficits were framed as temporary. They never were. At the same time, developing nations were encouraged to borrow heavily from international banks. Capital flowed outward. Risk followed. When global conditions shifted and interest rates rose, repayment collapsed. The Latin American debt crisis exposed the asymmetry of the system. Borrowers absorbed austerity. Lenders were protected. Losses were socialized. The pattern was clear. Debt discipline was enforced downward, never upward. The lesson was not restraint. It was precedent. The system had demonstrated that when obligations became too large, intervention would follow. This created moral hazard at scale. Risk was rewarded. Prudence was penalized. That logic reached its peak in 2008. The financial crisis was not triggered by housing alone. Housing was the surface expression of a deeper structure. Debt layered upon debt. Mortgages packaged into securities. Securities insured with derivatives. Leverage ratios stretched beyond sustainability. The system functioned only as long as prices rose. When a single segment failed, the entire structure destabilized. Banks faced collapse. Credit froze. Markets seized. Governments intervened with trillions. The justification was necessity. The consequence was entrenchment. Institutions deemed essential were rescued. Balance sheets were repaired. Losses were absorbed by the public. Meanwhile, ordinary households faced unemployment. Time 0.3s or foreclosure, and austerity. The system revealed its priorities. Debt was not neutral. It was a mechanism designed to preserve hierarchy under stress. After the crisis, reform was promised. Instead, expansion resumed. Interest rates were suppressed. Asset prices inflated. Debt grew faster than before. The numbers crossed from alarming into abstract. By the early 2020s, global debt exceeded $300 trillion. Governments, corporations, and households all participated. Some nations carried public debt multiples of their economic output. Others borrowed in foreign currencies, exposing themselves to sudden reversal. The entire structure depended on continuous confidence and low rates. Debt had become invisible. Deficits no longer felt immediate. Borrowing was embedded into daily life. Governments issued bonds quietly. Consumers relied on credit. Corporations leveraged balance sheets to inflate profits. Leverage felt weightless during expansion, but leverage obeys gravity. When conditions change, it amplifies pressure. This reality returned when central banks raised rates to fight inflation. Servicing costs surged. Budgets tightened. Refinancing became dangerous. The same debt that felt manageable suddenly revealed its weight. The system now rests on a contradiction. It requires low rates to survive, but low rates fuel inflation. It needs confidence, but confidence erodes under instability. Debt can delay adjustment, but it cannot eliminate it. This is where the present converges with history. When obligations exceed capacity, resolution becomes unavoidable. The only question is how the burden is redistributed. As debt reaches this scale, the illusion of control becomes psychological rather than mechanical. Politicians favor borrowing because it defers consequence. Raising taxes provokes immediate resistance. Cutting spending threatens political survival. Debt offers a third path that appears painless. The cost is shifted forward, dispersed, and obscured. Future generations become silent guarantors. This illusion holds only while rates remain low. When interest costs rise, the abstraction collapses. Servicing debt consumes budgets. Choices reappear. What was once invisible becomes unavoidable. This shift is already underway. As central banks tightened policy to contain inflation, the cost of carrying debt surged across the system. Governments faced a narrowing fiscal space. Households saw mortgage payments rise sharply. Corporations confronted refinancing at multiples of previous rates. Balance sheets that depended on cheap money began to strain. Debt behaves like a dormant force. While conditions are favorable, it feels manageable. When conditions reverse, it asserts dominance. Obligations that were rolled effortlessly become traps. The system discovers how little margin remains. Despite this, debt continues to be marketed as opportunity. Students are encouraged to borrow heavily for uncertain returns. Families are pushed to stretch for housing on the assumption that prices will always rise. Nations are told deficits do not matter because currency can be created indefinitely. This narrative sustains participation. History contradicts it. When debt accumulates beyond productive capacity, resolution follows one of three paths: repayment through growth and surplus, monetary erosion through inflation, or default through restructuring or refusal. No system has escaped these outcomes. Only the sequence varies. In the current configuration, honest repayment is implausible. Growth cannot outpace obligations of this magnitude. Default is politically destabilizing. That leaves inflation as the least visible option. It reduces the real value of debt while preserving nominal promises. It shifts cost quietly rather than abruptly. This process has already begun. Inflation acts as a hidden transfer. Savings lose purchasing power. Wages lag prices. Fixed incomes erode. Meanwhile, debt burdens shrink in real terms. Governments benefit. The public absorbs the loss. This is not conspiracy. It is arithmetic. Inflation is easier to tolerate politically than default. It diffuses responsibility. No single decision triggers blame. The system preserves itself by dispersing damage. At this stage, debt reveals its true function. It is not merely a financial instrument. It is a structure of power. It determines who is protected and who is exposed when adjustment becomes unavoidable. Banks are stabilized. Corporations restructure. Political leaders exit. Ordinary people absorb disruption. This pattern has repeated across empires and eras. When debt reaches saturation, the hierarchy hardens. Losses flow downward. Stability is preserved at the top. Understanding this does not require prediction. It requires recognition. The mechanisms are already in motion. The debate is no longer theoretical. It is operational. The cycle is nearing its resolution phase. Whether it arrives through prolonged inflation, episodic restructuring, or abrupt crisis, the destination remains consistent with history. Debt accumulates. Leaders delay. Adjustment arrives. Societies reset. This is not a warning. It is a pattern. Debt, at its endpoint, strips away every remaining illusion. When obligations can no longer be serviced without distortion, the system reveals its priorities with clarity. Promises are broken selectively. Losses are allocated strategically. Stability is preserved where it matters most to those in control. This is why debt crises never resolve evenly. Banks are rescued because they are systemic. Corporations are restructured because they are productive assets. Governments redefine terms because they write the rules. Ordinary citizens do not receive such accommodations. They experience the outcome through lost purchasing power. Time is at 0.3s, diminished security, and reduced opportunity. History records this outcome repeatedly. Sovereign defaults from Latin America to Eastern Europe. Currency collapses that erase decades of savings overnight. Inflationary episodes that hollowed out the middle class while preserving institutional balance sheets. Each time, the narrative changes. The mechanism does not. Debt concentrates risk upward during expansion and distributes pain downward during contraction. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is structural. Debt is created within a hierarchy, and resolution follows that same hierarchy. The final stage of every debt cycle is not financial. It is social. Trust erodes. Legitimacy weakens. Populations sense imbalance, even if they cannot articulate it. Political polarization intensifies. Extremes gain traction. Stability becomes fragile. This does not require collapse in a single moment. More often, it unfolds gradually. Inflation persists. Growth stagnates. Opportunities narrow. Expectations reset downward. Societies adapt to less while being told the system is functioning. Eventually, a formal reset occurs. It may arrive as restructuring. Time, thus 0.5s. It may arrive as currency reform. It may arrive as crisis. The form varies. The necessity does not. The present system stands at this threshold. Global debt is not simply high, it is structurally embedded. Removing it would require choices no political system is willing to make voluntarily. That leaves adjustment through erosion rather than decision. This is the quiet endgame of debt. Not a dramatic collapse, but a prolonged transfer. Value moves upward. Burden moves downward. Time replaces accountability. Understanding this is not about fear. It is about awareness. Time, 0.5s. Debt is not a neutral backdrop to modern life. It is the organizing force beneath it. It shapes incentives, behavior, and outcomes long before consequences appear. Every empire that believed it had escaped this logic was eventually corrected by it. The timelines differed. The instruments changed. The result remained constant. Global debt is not merely a number on a screen. It is the accumulated weight of postponed decisions. And when that weight exceeds what the system can carry, history does not negotiate, or it resolves.